The tornado sirens started at 3:47 a.m., and Mayor Thomas Mitchell knew his small town of Cedar Falls was about to face the worst natural disaster in its 150-year history. As emergency calls flooded in and infrastructure collapsed, the 58-year-old mayor, who'd spent 12 years fixing potholes and mediating parking disputes, suddenly transformed. His voice became commanding, his decisions tactical, his bearing unmistakably military. The town council watched in shock as their quiet mayor began coordinating disaster response with the precision of someone who'd commanded far more than a town of 8,000 people. And when the National Guard arrived to assist, their colonel took one look at Mitchell and snapped to attention. Because standing before him wasn't just a small-town mayor. Welcome to Veteran Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of hidden leadership, extraordinary service, and the moment when a quiet man's true nature emerged, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who serve in ways we never see. Cedar Falls, Iowa, population 8,247, was the kind of place where the biggest news was usually the high school football team's playoff chances or the annual Corn Festival Planning Committee meetings. Mayor Thomas Mitchell had been running the town for 12 years with the steady, unremarkable competence that small communities value above all else. At 58, Mitchell looked like what he was, a man who attended ribbon cuttings, mediated disputes between neighbors, and made sure the snow got plowed in winter. He drove a modest pickup truck, lived in a 1960s ranch house on Maple Street, and had never once raised his voice during a town council meeting, even when old Harry Peterson got worked up about the parking meters downtown. Most residents knew Mitchell had moved to Cedar Falls after retiring from government service, but nobody pressed for details. In small towns, you respect people's privacy, especially when they're good at their job and don't cause trouble. Mitchell was both. He'd been elected 3 times without opposition, which in Cedar Falls meant he must be doing something right. His biggest challenges were typically things like convincing the state to fix the bridge on Highway 34 or mediating the ongoing feud between the Methodist and Baptist churches over who got to use the community center on Sundays. Mitchell handled these issues with quiet diplomacy and practical solutions. He never sought publicity, never made grand speeches, and never acted like being mayor of Cedar Falls was preparation for higher office. He seemed genuinely content managing a small town's small problems. That was about to change. The National Weather Service had been tracking the storm system for 3 days, but Iowa weather was unpredictable, and forecasters weren't certain about the severity. Mitchell had attended the standard emergency preparedness briefing on Monday afternoon, same as he did for every weather event. Nothing unusual. By Tuesday evening, the warnings had intensified. Mitchell activated the town's emergency protocol, opened the community center as a shelter, made sure the volunteer fire department was ready, and sent out the automated phone system reminding residents to secure loose objects and stay indoors. Standard procedure for standard weather. Mitchell went home to his ranch house, set his phone to wake him if emergency services called, and went to bed expecting to deal with some downed trees and maybe a few power outages in the morning. At 3:47 a.m., the tornado sirens began their bone-chilling wail. Mitchell was awake before the second blast. He was dressed and in his truck before the sirens finished their first cycle. And as he drove toward the town hall through streets already littered with debris, something fundamental shifted in his demeanor. The Emergency Operations Center at Cedar Falls Town Hall was a single room with 2 desks, a police scanner, and a whiteboard for tracking incidents. It had been adequate for every emergency in the town's history, because the worst emergency in the town's history had been a house fire that took 3 hours to contain. Mitchell walked into that room at 4:15 a.m. and immediately began transforming it into something else entirely. I need communications with County Dispatch, State Emergency Management, and the National Weather Service, he told Deputy Police Chief Sarah Martinez, who'd arrived minutes earlier. Get me a direct line to the county sheriff and find out the ETA on state emergency response. Martinez stared at him. She'd worked with Mitchell for 8 years and had never heard him speak with that kind of crisp authority. "Sir, I'm not sure we have direct lines to—" "Then establish them," Mitchell interrupted, already moving to the whiteboard. "I need a status board showing infrastructure damage, casualty reports, and resource allocation, and get me someone who can patch us into the regional emergency frequency." Martinez began making calls, but she kept glancing at Mitchell with growing confusion. Where had their quiet mayor learned to set up an emergency command structure? By 5:30 a.m., the scope of the disaster was becoming clear. The tornado hadn't just touched down, it had carved a path of destruction through the center of Cedar Falls that would have challenged cities 10 times larger. The water treatment plant was damaged, the main electrical substation was destroyed, and Highway 34 was blocked by debris in 6 places. Town council members began arriving at the town hall, expecting to find their mayor overwhelmed and seeking guidance. Instead, they found Mitchell running a military precision operation from what had been a simple emergency notification center. "Infrastructure assessment teams," Mitchell was saying into a radio headset that nobody remembered him having. "I need damage reports on all critical systems within 2 hours. Medical teams establish triage at the high school gym. Logistics, I want resource requirements and supply chain analysis on my desk in 30 minutes. Council member Janet Williams looked around the transformed room in amazement. Where had they gotten all this equipment? When had Mitchell learned to coordinate multiple agencies simultaneously? And why was he talking like someone who'd commanded disaster responses before? "Tom," Williams said tentatively, "where did you learn to do all this?" Mitchell looked up from a map where he was marking priority zones with the kind of tactical notation most civilians wouldn't recognize. "Long time ago," he said simply, then turned back to coordinating the evacuation of the senior living center. At 8:45 a.m., a convoy of vehicles arrived at the town hall. Iowa National Guard, FEMA regional coordinators, and state emergency management officials had all responded to reports of major disaster in Cedar Falls. They expected to find a small-town government overwhelmed and needing federal takeover of the response effort. Instead, they found an operation that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood large-scale emergency management at the highest levels. Colonel James Peterson, commanding the National Guard response team, walked into the Emergency Operations Center and stopped dead. The organization, the communications setup, the status boards, the coordinated logistics — this was an amateur hour. He approached the man clearly running the operation, a middle-aged civilian in jeans and a Cedar Falls volunteer firefighter t-shirt who was coordinating helicopter landing zones with air traffic control. "Sir, I'm Colonel Peterson, Iowa National Guard. I'm here to assist with disaster response coordination." The man turned around, and Peterson's military training kicked in automatically. He found himself looking at someone whose bearing, expression, and manner of command were unmistakably those of a senior military officer. "Colonel," the man said, extending his hand. "Tom Mitchell, mayor of Cedar Falls. Glad you're here. I've got helicopter assets inbound for medical evacuation, but I need your ground vehicles for infrastructure assessment in grid sectors 7 through 12. Peterson shook Mitchell's hand, but his mind was racing. This wasn't how civilian officials typically interacted with military commanders. Mitchell was giving directions with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed by colonels. "Sir," Peterson said carefully, "have we met before?" Mitchell looked at him for a moment, then turned back to his status board. "I don't think so, Colonel, but we can discuss personal history later. Right now, I need those vehicles deployed." FEMA Regional Director Carol Stevens arrived 2 hours later, expecting to find a disaster scene requiring federal intervention and coordination. Instead, she found a response operation that was running more smoothly than most major city emergency efforts she'd supervised. She approached Mitchell, who was coordinating with power company crews and state highway departments simultaneously. "Mr. Mayor," she said, "I'm Carol Stevens, FEMA Region 7. This is an impressive operation you're running here." "Thank you," Mitchell replied without looking up from his communications board. "We're managing, but I'll need federal assistance for long-term infrastructure rebuilding." Stevens studied Mitchell's operation more carefully. The organizational structure, the communication protocols, the coordination of multiple agencies, this all looked familiar, very familiar. "Sir," she said quietly, "what's your background in emergency management?" Mitchell finally looked at her directly. "I've dealt with complex operational situations before." Stevens nodded slowly. She'd worked with enough military commanders to recognize one when she saw one. "What branch?" "Army." "What level of command?" Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, then returned to his status board. "High enough to know what I'm doing." At 2:30 p.m., a black SUV arrived at the town hall. A man in a business suit walked directly to the Emergency Operations Center and approached Mitchell. "General Mitchell," he said quietly, "I'm David Walsh, Pentagon Liaison for Domestic Emergency Operations. We've been monitoring the situation here." The room went completely silent. Every volunteer, every staff member, every official who'd been working the disaster response stopped what they were doing. General Mitchell. Town Council member Janet Williams felt her legs give out slightly. Their mild-mannered mayor, who'd spent 12 years mediating disputes about parking meters and snow removal, was a general. Mitchell looked at Walsh with an expression of resignation. "Mr. Walsh, I was hoping to keep this local." "Sir, with respect, you're coordinating a multi-state emergency response from a small-town emergency center. That doesn't stay local." Mitchell removed his headset and turned to face the room full of people staring at him in shock. "I suppose introductions are in order," he said with a slight smile. Over the next hour, as the immediate emergency operations continued under Mitchell's direction, the truth slowly emerged. Thomas Mitchell wasn't just a general. He was a 4-star general who had retired as one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. Army. General Thomas Mitchell, former commanding general of U.S. Central Command, responsible for military operations across the Middle East. Former commanding general of Multinational Force Iraq during the surge operations. Former deputy chief of staff of the Army. A man who had commanded hundreds of thousands of troops, coordinated international coalitions, and managed operations involving billions of dollars in resources. And for 12 years, he'd been the mayor of Cedar Falls, Iowa. Population 8,247. "Why?" Janet Williams asked when she finally found her voice. "Why here? Why this?" Mitchell was quiet for a moment, watching his emergency teams coordinate the response to Cedar Falls' worst disaster. "Because," he said simply, "service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just takes different forms." As the disaster response continued through the afternoon, Mitchell shared pieces of his story with the town council members who'd worked with him for years without knowing who he really was. "I retired in 2011, he explained during a brief break in operations. 35 years of military service, most of it at levels where failure meant people died and success meant missions most Americans would never hear about." Deputy Chief Martinez, who'd been taking orders from Mitchell all day, shook her head in amazement. "But why Cedar Falls?" "Because I was tired," Mitchell said simply. "Tired of making decisions that affected millions of people. Tired of operations where one mistake could start wars or get soldiers killed. I wanted somewhere quiet where the biggest decision was whether to approve a new stop sign." He gestured around the Emergency Operations Center. "I thought I could retire from all this, but when your community needs leadership, you don't get to stay retired." As the day progressed, the people of Cedar Falls began to understand what it meant to have a 4-star general managing their disaster response. Mitchell's coordination of resources, his ability to cut through bureaucratic delays, and his skill at managing complex multi-agency operations were unlike anything they'd ever witnessed. When state officials tried to redirect federal resources to larger cities, Mitchell made one phone call, and the resources stayed in Cedar Falls. When communication problems threatened to delay medical evacuations, Mitchell established direct military communication links within minutes. When logistics bottlenecks slowed relief supplies, Mitchell reorganized the entire distribution system with the kind of efficiency that comes from managing operations across multiple combat zones. Colonel Peterson, who'd been watching Mitchell work all day, finally understood what he was seeing. "Sir," he said to Mitchell during an operational briefing, "you're not just coordinating this response, you're running it like a military campaign." Mitchell looked at him seriously. "Colonel, disaster response is a military campaign. The enemy is chaos. The mission is saving lives, and victory is measured in how many people go home safely. The principles don't change just because you're not wearing a uniform." By evening, news outlets had picked up the story of the small-town mayor who was actually a four-star general. National media descended on Cedar Falls, expecting to find a human interest story about a retired military officer helping his community. Instead, they found one of the most effective disaster responses in recent memory, managed by someone who'd coordinated operations involving hundreds of times more people and resources. Mitchell refused all interview requests, referring media to the town's communication director while he continued managing the ongoing response. But his reputation began to spread through military and emergency management networks. "Do you know who's running the Cedar Falls response?" became a common question in Pentagon and FEMA circles. "It's Tom Mitchell. The Tom Mitchell." Young emergency management officials began requesting permission to observe Mitchell's operation, treating it as a masterclass in disaster coordination. Military officers driving through Iowa took detours to see how a four-star general managed emergency operations at the local level. The revelation of Mitchell's background created mixed reactions among Cedar Falls residents. Some felt betrayed that he'd hidden such an important part of his identity. Others felt honored that someone of his stature had chosen to serve their community. At a town meeting 3 days after the tornado, resident Mary Henderson stood up to address Mitchell directly. "General, or Mayor, I don't know what to call you anymore. Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Mitchell considered the question carefully. "Because I wasn't a general anymore. I was your mayor, and I wanted to be judged on how well I served Cedar Falls, not on what I'd done before I got here." Another resident, Farmer Bill Jackson, raised his hand. "Well, you served us pretty damn well during this disaster. I don't care if you used to be the president. You saved lives here." The room erupted in applause, and Mitchell felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the simple satisfaction of serving people who appreciated competent leadership without expecting anything in return. In the weeks following the tornado, Mitchell's dual identity became part of Cedar Falls folklore. Visitors would come to see the town where a four-star general served as mayor, and residents began to take pride in having attracted someone of Mitchell's caliber to their community. But Mitchell insisted on returning to normal mayoral duties as soon as the emergency response concluded. He attended city council meetings, dealt with snow removal complaints, and mediated the ongoing Methodist Baptist Church scheduling dispute with the same patient attention he'd always shown. The only difference was that now, when major decisions needed to be made, the council deferred to Mitchell's judgment with a new level of respect. They'd seen what his leadership could accomplish under pressure. "Tom," Councilmember Williams said during a budget meeting, "do you ever miss it? The big operations, the important decisions?" Mitchell looked around the conference room where they were debating whether to spend $50,000 on new playground equipment. "Janet," he said, "the playground equipment is an important decision. It affects every family in this town. In my experience, there's no such thing as unimportant service, only service that different people value differently." 1 year after the tornado, Cedar Falls had not only recovered but had become a model for disaster preparedness and response. Mitchell had used his military experience to create emergency protocols that other small towns began adopting. The federal government offered Mitchell consulting positions with FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security. Universities invited him to teach courses on emergency management. Defense contractors offered him executive positions. Mitchell declined them all. "I'm the mayor of Cedar Falls," he told each recruiter. "That's a full-time job." But he did agree to train other small-town officials in emergency preparedness, hosting quarterly workshops at the Cedar Falls Community Center. These sessions became legendary among rural emergency managers. The chance to learn disaster coordination from someone who'd managed operations across multiple countries. 2 years after the tornado, the president signed legislation creating the National Disaster Preparedness Excellence Award. The first recipient was the city of Cedar Falls, Iowa, in recognition of their outstanding disaster response and recovery. The award ceremony was held in the White House Rose Garden. Mitchell attended in a simple business suit, representing his town as mayor, not as a former general. But when the president presented the award, he made sure to acknowledge both roles. This award recognizes not just effective disaster response, the president said, but the kind of leadership that emerges when experience meets dedication and service never truly ends. After the ceremony, a young Army captain approached Mitchell. "General, sir, I'm Captain Rodriguez. I studied your Iraq operations at Command and General Staff College. It's an honor to meet you." Mitchell shook the captain's hand. "Thank you, Captain. But today I'm just the mayor of Cedar Falls, and that's exactly how I like it." 5 years after the tornado, Mitchell was re-elected mayor for the fourth time, still without opposition. Cedar Falls had become known throughout Iowa as the town with the general mayor, but to residents, he was simply the man who fixed their problems and kept their community running smoothly. During the election night celebration at the community center, a reporter asked Mitchell if he ever regretted leaving such a high-level military career for small-town politics. Mitchell looked around the room filled with neighbors who'd become friends, council members who'd become confidants, and residents who trusted him with their community's future. "Young man," he said, "I've commanded armies and managed military budgets larger than most nations' GDP. But I've never had a more important job than being mayor of Cedar Falls, because these people depend on me, and I don't ever want to let them down." Outside, the tornado sirens were being tested for their monthly check. Mitchell listened to the sound that had once revealed his true nature to his community and smiled. Sometimes the most important service happens in the quietest places, performed by people who never stopped answering the call to lead. General Thomas Mitchell never intended for his true background to be revealed. He'd come to Cedar Falls seeking the peaceful anonymity of small-town service, hoping to leave behind the weight of commanding at the highest levels of military leadership. But when disaster struck, training and instinct took over. The habits of command, the reflexes of leadership, and the responsibility of service couldn't be hidden when people's lives were at stake. Mitchell's story reminds us that leadership isn't about rank or recognition. It's about competence, dedication, and the willingness to serve whenever and wherever you're needed. Whether commanding armies or managing small towns, the principles remain the same. Take care of people, accomplish the mission, and never forget that service is a privilege, not a burden. So now I ask you, have you ever encountered someone whose quiet competence suggested depths you couldn't imagine? Someone whose leadership emerged only when it was needed most? Share their story in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Because at Veteran Stories, we believe that true leaders serve at every level, and the greatest commanders are often the ones who choose to lead in the humblest circumstances. Subscribe if stories like this matter to you. Because every community deserves leaders who understand that service never truly ends. It just takes different forms.